And start with who was the first one to go? Oh, okay, you can go. I didn't know you were reading yours as well.
This question is for this panel. The argument about procreation is very strange. I'm in a lesbian relationship, and my partner and I have been together for 5 years, and I still have uterus. But I'm planning on having children one day. And every decision my partner and I have made thus far has been for our future family. We talk about family planning, I mean family planning. Like when she was going to school for nursing, I supported her financially to that. I covered her insurance costs. And now that she's graduated, now that she's graduated, she tried to cover me on her insurance, and it wouldn't happen. We both work at the same facility. I cannot work because I've been going to school, and I was not covered. This really scares me because one day when we do have our kids, what if we already planned that I'm having the children because there's not as many health problems in our family, and what if her place of employment offers better insurance, and we want our kids on her insurance? It's not going to happen right now, and it's not really the separate but equal, the civil union thing is not really equal because we do have to constantly cover all the bases that heterosexual couples take for granted when they get married. It's about families, not just about the couple, but their children. And there are thousands of gay families with children. And how is it justifiable to deny them equal rights to other children in hetero families?
Well, firstly, I'd like to congratulate you. You're very fortunate, I'm sure, to have found her. I wish the two of you had a very long life together. And you'll notice that our society has changed to the point where it is no longer said that the only way for children to have any kind of legal status is if they are born in a marriage. We no longer use the terms legitimate or illegitimate. We call people bastards all the time, but not in that ancient definitional sense. So, what we have is a situation where relationships that aren't engaged in a marriage still have many of the benefits that back in the day were only associated with marriage. That marriage was the only context in which sexual activity was permitted. We now have expanded this to other kinds of relationships. So, why is it that specifically you and she need to be married in order to engage all the benefits of insurance? We have just seen, just 2 years ago, the most significant change in American healthcare in the last 70 years passed as an act of Congress. There is nothing in preventing same-sex marriage which precludes other pieces of legislation accomplishing everything that you wish to experience through what has been argued as same-sex marriage. So, because there are other remedies available, the burden of proof shifts back on why specifically those sorts of benefits should only be derived from marriage. Specifically, why the state would then have a compelling reason to only legitimize any two individuals that chose to get married and then marginalize any other two individuals who had an identical relationship except for that marriage license. So it is not that anyone on this side is in favor of denying anyone insurance benefits. But we believe that everything that you seek to accomplish can be done just as effectively or even better through other means, in part because it won't involve the same kind of acrimony that we were told is holding our society back in the specific debate over gay marriage.
Okay, next question.
Okay, hi.
Lady first.
Okay, so you guys are presenting an argument that I've actually never heard before. Forgive me if this is a little base, but it's sort of sounding like we don't see a benefit, so why should we give a fuck? And no, right? I mean, am I right? I'm hearing, it doesn't benefit the state, so we shouldn't do it. All that stuff you just threw at her saying that, you know, she could do it a different way, so why bother with this? And it's like, well, you guys probably don't know. I mean, are either of you bisexual or gay? No. Okay. So it's a little different, and if really there is no benefit, what my question is what's the worst case scenario? What is it that's stopping this? If you're saying, well, there's other ways to go about it, why not just go about it that way? I'm just really confused. Well, I'll keep it short. What is the worst case scenario? Gays get married tomorrow. All of them. All of them get married tomorrow. Go.
Well, since we're dealing with since the benefits that can't be obtained any other way are financial, then obviously we'd be dealing with the financial side of things. So the government, all of the government policies are designed in some way to promote a more stable society. Their investment, their cost needs to be justified. And so I guess the quick summary of our argument is, yes, we did not see any justification for why this would help society, nor did we hear any opposing reasons why. And so the burden of proof would be on the proponents of it to show why there is a societal interest for specifically this path. As opposed to anything else.
Well, and
Actually, no, I have to ask, because the point of this debate was to have a philosophically sound back and forth between the audience. Actually, no, I'll leave that as a rebuttal, but I have to add, let's move on, just because we have a lot of questions, so you go.
All right. My question. Well, I think first of all, because after her question, I think that all the arguments you just made could be made to argue against heterosexual marriage, because since heterosexual couples get a tax deduction, then what they could actually do is achieve all those benefits by other means. But my second point, obviously recognizing same-sex marriage would, as Casey was trying to argue, that it is recognizing the union between these two people, but there is also the second part, which is a massive benefit to the state, and I brought my source just so there wasn't any issue with that. According to a 2007 report by the Williams Institute and the Urban Institute, 65,000 kids were living with adoptive gay parents between 2000 and 2002, with another 14,000 in foster homes headed by gays and lesbians. And as Casey was pointing out, something like more than 400,000 kids in foster care. But anyway, so obviously the state has to pump a lot of money into our failing foster care system, and there's a huge amount of evidence about these children having mental disorders and different things. This research suggests that gays and lesbians are more likely than heterosexuals to adopt older, special needs and minority children, and these are the children that don't get adopted. So my question is, how is that, like, if you give gays and lesbians a tax deduction, make it easier by allowing them marriage, so the state pumps money toward them, allows them to adopt, which saves children, helps the foster care system, how is that not benefiting the state?
well, there are two distinct parts of your question. Firstly, I'm going to kick it to Mike to deal specifically with the tax benefits, if you don't mind.
Right now, I'm making sure that part that way.
Okay, he'll deal with that in a second. So, the argument that you're putting forward is not that the reason why we should have same-sex marriage is equal rights. It is not so that people enjoy some kind of unique dignity in marriage. The argument you're putting forward is simply that we need to get homosexual couples to marry in order to clean out the foster care system.
That's the argument you made with
we don't need
to. Children. You made the exact same argument.
No, sir, they're not the exact same argument.
Yeah, about children, raising children to be successful. That's exactly the argument you made.
No, the argument is that the reason why the state has chosen to promote heterosexual marriage, it is the only means, or it is the only two people that have the equipment to produce new children. What you're talking about is a system where what we should do is simply create many more incentives for individuals of all types to adopt children out of the foster care system. Your critique presumes that every argument that you put forward, every argument that's put forward today, only works if homosexual couples then do take children out of the foster care system. So, what we need to do then is not create marriage.
Have children.
It only works.
Sterile people shouldn't be allowed to marry.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up, because let's look at a situation where you have a man and a woman who choose to get married. Now, they can choose not to have children. 2, they may not have the ability to have children. The only way that you could know whether or not they're going to do that is if the state gave a fertility test before everyone got married. We're not talking about a state requirement for people to have children. We're talking about a state encouragement for children to do the same. So the definition of same-sex marriage you're advancing is not about equality or equal rights. It only works if you then impose upon homosexual couples a duty to remove children from the foster care system. And we don't believe that any two people should then be required to raise children. But you clearly want to jump in and move on to another question.
Yep. Sorry, we just don't want fights to we don't want it to be too bickery, so we're just trying to streamline it.
What was wrong with her?
I thought they had answered it. If you fellas, you guys.
Did you feel that?
Did you feel our question?
No, yeah.
Oh, well, I thought they already. I didn't.
No, she felt. We were just trying to.
Yeah, we didn't think they both had to answer. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right.
Would you like to finish your question?
Yeah, do you want to finish your answer to her question?
Well, the only thing I would like to say is the lady opened her question by stating that because I am neither homosexual or bisexual, I do not have a right to opine upon this matter. Because it does not directly affect me, I have no opinion. If that was the case, that is in fact what you said. I'm sorry, that's actually what you said. You really did.
Okay. We're going
Okay.
to move on.
Can we like record?
Okay. So we have a question. We have a question for this side. Why is marriage essential? Why are other legal remedies insufficient? Such as changes to adoption laws, living will laws, hospital visitation laws. Why are those routes not sufficient? Why do we have to jump all the way up to legalizing same-sex marriage to achieve our ends?
Oh, could you say it again?
Why is marriage essential to achieve the ends that we want to see in place? Why are other legal remedies not sufficient?
So, I don't know if I fully understand this question. I believe, if I'm understanding it correctly, and we've discussed this, me and Samantha recently discussed this earlier, is if we allow everything that marriage permits, if we allow hospital visitations, health insurance policies, tax exemption, if we allow all those things to take place, but we still just don't allow homosexuals to call it marriage, but we give them every single right that heterosexual couples do, then what's the problem? That's a good question. What is the difference? If we give them all the rights, and all we try to do is separate out the word marriage, what's the problem? I don't know what that problem is, other than it's using different language. It's telling someone you can call it that, you can't call it this, we can call it that. I mean, that's basically what it would boil down to, is you're imposing on someone, you cannot call it this because we say so, which I find to be a problem. I find that to be discriminatory. Some of you may not, but if you allowed all these legal actions to take place, and I'm not sure if that's even what the questioner is asking, but.
Thank you.
Did we have more Ask Jones over here? Okay, yeah.
You just kind of covered what I had, but mine was for the state and legalizing it. The way I see it is there are more benefits than just economic. And my question though too is, where does the state come up with the information that a heterosexual couple produces or can produce better children in the homes? Like I just want to know where that kind of information comes from. Like how would the state come up with that information? And how would that also not create a social hierarchy saying these relationships are okay, but these ones are okay too, but the legalization of this one still has an implement of saying there's a hierarchy here that we're supporting?
Well, we have, my apologies. Sir?
No.
Start off with a question towards you, then move it over here. While I don't have the studies at hand at the moment, we have decades of university and even government research that shows statistically children from, for example, a two-parent home, one, come from better socioeconomic circumstances than children from a single-parent home, and two, that they have better socioeconomic outcomes. Now, I do apologize that I don't have the figures at my hand, but we have decades of study that back this up. Now, to the hierarchy point, this is exactly what we do through the creation of marriage. We are not saying, and this, even if we completely exclude the same-sex element, and we're just talking about different sex marriage versus different sex other relationships, the state does acknowledge that hierarchy because of the evidence that shows that it is generally better for both present circumstances and long-term outcomes for children to be raised in a married couple. This does not mean that there are not individual exceptions. This does not mean that, well, if you're from a marriage, you're going to turn out fantastic. But this is what the preponderance of the evidence tells us. This is what is most statistically likely. And that, because those unions tend to produce better outcomes, is exactly why the state does provide a marriage license and the other sundry benefits that flow from marriage, as opposed to treating other kinds of relationships exactly the same way. Because they don't, in the long run, have the same kind of socioeconomic benefit to both the individual and to the state. And then we can extrapolate that out into other kinds of relationships.
I don't think this is the reason at all. Social hierarchy, it's basically putting into, as the questioner discusses social hierarchy, the preponderance of evidence, this argument put forward, the preponderance of evidence shows that single mothers in Harlem aren't going to raise good children, or drug-addicted people are not going to raise better children than people that aren't. People that make $200,000 a year are going to be able to provide greater resources for people that make $20,000 a year. They do not take interest in this. Why do they not? Because it is not the real reason. The real reason is rooted in religion, in tradition. It's rooted in religion. It really is. It has nothing to do with these things. There's the preponderance of evidence against socioeconomic status. What would happen then? We would then allow only people that made $250,000 a year. They could make 3 children, but other people could only make 1. I mean, it gets into such a convoluted argument. I'd also like to touch on the argument put forth that the reason is children. And quote, they have the ability to bring forth children. This is the state's interest. I still haven't gotten a good argument for what do we do for people that choose to get married and never have children. People who are known to be sterile and get married. They are not in the state's interest. The state is not doing a very good job if that's the argument. The state's doing a horrible job. I would like to know what he would like to do about fixing how terrible the state is doing at this.
Can I respond to that? On the, about being whether it's parental absence or the lack of having a second income, actually there was a study called Parental Absence of Poverty, which matters more. They concluded that family structure was more important than money. On the saying that the real reason is not about children, whether it's religion or fear, I was unaware that the personal character of the debaters was the topic of tonight's debate. I thought it was on the legality of gay marriage. And third point, on the, well, what if the couple either chooses to never have children or cannot? It would be very difficult for the state to test for this either ahead of time or during a marriage, and let's say the couple then becomes infertile, is that marriage then dissolved? That would be very difficult for the state to do that. So,
Here's the answer. All right. Let's go through these and review it. Okay. I'm sorry that if we've excluded anything. But, okay. I'm gonna read this question. What do we have any understanding of that haven't been answered? I mean,
I feel like most of the issues is this.
Okay. This one I don't think has exactly. If the state's involvement in marriage is primarily for the sake of children, how is gay marriage on the same level as incest? Incest produces children with health problems. Gay marriage does not produce any children. And there is no proof that a child raised by homosexuals is a problem for our society. And I think that also is telling, considering the data you mentioned a minute ago involved two-parent households that didn't seem to necessarily have any bearing on the gender of the two parents. It just seemed to be two parents there. So if you want to answer the question.
could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry, okay, if it's on the same level as incest, as far as they deny marriage on that ground, so incest produces children with health problems, gay marriage does not, and there is no proof that children raised by homosexuals is a problem for society. So how can it be on the same level as incest?
So I see two issues, or I guess two things being brought up. The incest for kids with health problems. The other one is kids raised by gay parents. Although the argument that we put forth was not just on the raising of children, but also the procreation and raising of children. You could probably talk more about that. I guess that's all I have right now.
Well, the distinction is that we have provided a compelling interest for the state in having marriage. And why specifically that then feeds into the state only allowing different sex marriage. This is not the state prohibiting anyone else from entering into a romantic union of their choice or in engaging in procreation of their choice. But because the purpose of marriage is to create a union that, one, is capable of producing children, and two, is most likely to produce good outcomes for those children, the state then has an interest in promoting a certain kind of union. The arguments that we've heard from the other side are not arguments in favor of permitting same-sex marriage. They are instead arguments for extending the societal franchise to any kind of relationship that you see at any point. Because we have no framework of what the state's interest is in having marriage at all. They put forward not arguments for legalizing same-sex marriage, but arguments for doing away with any kind of state sanctioning of marriage and simply having the state endorse and provide benefits to any coupling that two people wish to declare to be permanent.
Okay. To actually do one quick question.
Yeah, sure. People can leave, so I mean, you can ask questions if you want. Yeah.
What I think is interesting is we have some evidence here by the individual, and we actually have seen it in. If I can actually point out the famous movie starring Neil Patrick Harris. Homosexual couples are getting married with the intention of procreating, whether it be surrogate embryo or surrogate sperm. It's an intention for their families. Therefore, raising a child with two parents in a house of, I'm going to say median and mean incomes because, you know, hopefully that's what kind of happens there. But it's nothing different. It's still two kids, or I'm sorry, it's still two parents with the intention of raising people, or raising children, and possibly adoption. It's still the same exact thing. And if we can give them all the same benefits as well with legislature, why would we go through that process when we can just grant them marriage and cut out all this extra work?
So the argument then is that the reason to allow homosexual marriage is so that they, either through adoption or surrogacy, can bring forth children or raise children. And so homosexual marriage then becomes incumbent purely upon the existence of the children. Whereas we've also discussed the existence of infertile heterosexual couples or couples that choose not to have children. So what you're talking about is changing the definition of both heterosexual and homosexual marriage, not to be an institution for the encouragement of children, but an institution that exists solely and is entirely incumbent upon the production of children. Now, we can have that debate, but I don't believe that's the debate that we had today.
Okay, I'm a little disappointed in you, panel, because you could have done some research that would have showed how costly it is and how not time efficient it is for a gay couple to go and cover all the legal bases they have to cover. As yet, it's been really talked about here tonight. But it is very expensive. You don't cover everything. You don't know if you've covered every base. And there are still situations where, for instance, I had a coworker, lesbian. She and her partner had a child when the child was 3 years old. They went through, I guess you could say, divorce, although they weren't legally married, so it wasn't a legal divorce. And her other partner took the child from her because she's the one who bore it and gave birth to it. She said, "Can I at least have visitation?" And she said no. And she got together with a straight man, and they got married, and he got the child, and they raised the child together. And this lesbian mother, who had raised him until he was 3 years old, had no rights to him. So they didn't cover all their bases, did they? You're essentially asking, what you're asking is that we go and cover ourselves. And it's not equal, it's not right, it's not fair. We can't always be prepared, you know? We don't always know if we've got everything settled and it's going to be fine in the future.
But your argument presupposes that if they had been formally married and then they formally divorced, that your friend would have been granted either equal custody or visitation to the child. Whereas we see that when couples who are formally married get formally divorced, that's not always the case. Sometimes they share custody. Sometimes one gets full custody with visitation rights. Sometimes one gets custody with no visitation rights from the other.
They have more legal sway in a court than a gay couple would have. More legal sway.
Well, except if we can produce a...
And it's separate and equal, and you know it. And this is why I'm very disappointed with the other panel. You can find that out. Just gotta go to the gay rights website and just got all listed. So.
Well, I would be arguing counterfactually if I were to say that, no, it's a cool. Marriage is a panacea, and it solves all problems. There are no custody issues. There is nothing bad that's ever happened to anybody that's married. That's clearly not the case. And so it is equally false to claim then that if there was homosexual marriage, that would be a panacea, and it would solve all of these problems. We're engaged now with issues far beyond simply whether or not same-sex marriage should be legalized, because we're dealing with much more fundamental problems of the disintegration of families and then the aftermath of that and how that becomes entangled with the legal system. So I do not mean to put forward, and never did, that heterosexual marriage is a panacea. By the same token, homosexual marriage is not a panacea. People will still be people, and they're still going to screw up and cause lots of problems that will reverberate through their lives and, sadly, the lives of their children also.
Oh, wait, there's...
Everyone knows that the final word always belongs to Dr. Mestig.
I have to confess something. You have succeeded in confusing me. I say it with all due respect.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have a question, and then a follow-up question. The question is, what are the legal reasons for marriage?
Well, marriage tends to promote a more stable society. I could search through this for data.
Can you give me the legal reasons for marriage, and then right next to each reason, tell me why
Raising a
homosexuals
family
should not?
will then lead to promoting a more stable society. And so if we wanted to then say homosexual marriage must be oriented on raising children before it then gets authorization by the state, I guess that's a separate issue. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, but he had children to the reason for marriage, did you?
Yes.
you are having children.
Not as you must have children, but as at least in heterosexual marriage, it is the encouragement because you are very easily able to. But
If it is only the encouragement, why then is the discouragement made against the law? Why doesn't marriage encourage and then discourage too? That what I mean by that is, if people can have children, if a woman and a man can marry and have children, great, let them get married. Although I am opposed to marriage in principle. But it's a different matter, it's personal matter. But if a man and a woman can marry and have children, fantastic. If they can marry and do not have the ability to have children, why not let them get married too? Then by the same reasoning, children become irrelevant to the existence of marriage. And then why can't a man and a man or a woman and a woman marry and have children if they can adopt them or have them in any artificial way? Or not have children if they choose not to have children? Why is there a relationship between marriage and children?
Well, the reason is this. Because the only way to know beforehand that a heterosexual couple are not going to have children is to conduct extensive and intrusive medical examinations. Whereas we know that the majority of heterosexual couples are going to produce viable offspring. Now, if we want to say, and that's awesome,
Doesn't care if I'm gay.
except this is the distinction. You do require at least 1/3 individual to fertilize.
I can find him in a bar.
I know, no, you can totally find him in this room. But, and that is why we do not.
This debate's getting salty.
Well, wait, yeah. So, again, there are lots of individual examples where a marriage will not produce children. There are lots of examples where a homosexual relationship, in the form even of a homosexual marriage, will produce children. And that exists. But it requires the intervention of a third party from outside. Therefore, by its very nature, it is not the same kind of union, because it is not those two individuals bringing forth a child. It is those two individuals and either an anonymous donor or a good friend who's decided to contribute to this cause. Therefore, you're suddenly involving minimum 3 people in this relationship. And so, what is the rationale for limiting it? No, sir, but what is the rationale then for limiting it only to 2? Why should it only be the 2 women who are married and not the gentleman who contributed the biological material? So your argument is not an argument for same-sex marriage. It is an argument for what we need to do is just allow as many people as want to form this free association for whatever purpose they wish to advance.
No, the same heterosexual couple that couldn't have children can use a donor to produce a child.
Mm-hmm.
Why is
And then, why is that illegal? Why isn't that illegal?
Well, so now, instead of simply talking about why we should or should not legalize same-sex marriage, you're asking me to assume the burden of defending any kind of surrogacy. In which case, we come back to the argument that then marriage is incumbent only upon the production of children. Whereas we say that any relationship that in potentia has the ability to produce children, or as far as the state's knowledge, without intrusive medical examination, has in potentia the ability to produce children, then accomplishes the state's goal of promoting child rearing within this context. Whereas if essentially, from the beginning, in potentia you require third parties, you are then not promoting just same-sex marriage, but you're providing a societal endorsement for polygamy, bigamy, or any other kind of arrangement to bring in as many individuals as you need. But you guys will be nervous.
In other words, you oppose.
Well, then I'll be happy to come back and we'll have the polygamy argument. It'll be awesome.
Good job.
All right, thank you for all the questions, and thank you to both panels. Now, what we've seen here tonight is two different arguments on either side of an issue, and I ask you to remember that these are arguments, and that we've seen flaws with both sides. That's the important thing, is the purpose of tonight was to see what each person on each side of this issue is thinking, and to try to come together and have a dialogue between those two to see where these arguments are flawed, where their strengths are. And so I ask you to remember that these are arguments on the side of an issue. That is what we have to keep in mind. That our purpose here tonight was to discuss argumentation, was to discuss logic and philosophy. And that is the spirit in which we'd like you to lead.